The dust from the Second World War was still settling. The looming Cold War was threatening to tear the world apart. In October 1950, Lester Markell, editor of the Sunday edition of the New York Times, gathered 34 editors from 15 countries. Together, they founded the International Press Institute, or IPI. IPI's mission, as Markell put it, was to advance the cause of a critical and independent journalism wherever it is practiced, correct the distortions of years of entrenched propaganda, and dispel the fogs that clouded the relations among countries. IPI was born at a time of global division. That's why promoting dialogue has always been central to our purpose. Since the 1950s, we've brought together editors and journalists from countries riven by conflict to encourage understanding and fair coverage. We started with French and German editors. We first brought them together in January 1954, inside the headquarters of the Council of Europe, a space both sides considered to be neutral territory. There were 10 meetings in all, continued throughout the 50s and 60s. These gatherings laid the foundations for the first meeting between French President Charles de Gaulle and German Chancellor Konrad Adenauer. That was a meeting organized by IPI on September 14, 1958. It planted the seed for the 1963 Élysée Treaty, restoring relations between the two countries. IPI's dialogue efforts quickly spread across the globe. In March 1961, we brought together Greek and Turkish editors on the island of Rhodes. Japanese and Korean editors held 5 meetings during the 1960s. And in 1970, IPI gathered Japanese and American news professionals for the first time since the Japanese surrender 25 years earlier. In the 1990s, IPI kept channels of communication open among journalists in the former Yugoslavia. And in the 2000s, IPI worked with Israeli and Palestinian journalists to produce Use with Care. This was a guide for media professionals reporting on one of the most complex conflicts of the last century. This work over 70 years has granted IPI international prestige. In 1976, IPI was honored to be a candidate for the Nobel Peace Prize, and 30 years later, in 2006, IPI was the recipient of the News and Documentary Emmy Award for its press freedom work. IPI's efforts to promote exchange among media professionals who strive for accurate, fact-based, independent and sustainable journalism are at the core of the IPI World Congress. The Congress was founded in 1951 as the annual gathering of IPI members. Since then, it has grown into a leading global forum where journalists, editors, publishers, and press freedom campaigners gather in one place. You find a lot of magic there, with cultures and practices meeting, meshing, linked by a shared commitment to independent journalism.
Joan, I wanted to get your suggestion or your recommendation for American journalists who are now dealing with a situation that somewhat may not be as extreme, but that you and your colleagues have been dealing with for quite some time, as it relates to threats from the government.
My recommendation would be they should continue doing what they know best, and that is to bring out the truth, regardless of who is in that position. It doesn't matter who they are, whether president or whatever, because even the president has to be accountable to the people. He is not president of himself. He's the president of all the American citizens, so they have to stand strong and continue doing that which is right.
The Congress has also served as a powerful symbol of the struggle for press freedom and democratic values, often in countries on the brink of change. In 1989, the Congress took place in the divided city of Berlin, just months before the wall came tumbling down. Former West German Chancellor Willy Brandt told Congress participants, "Looking into the next century, I would not be without optimism that mankind has a chance to make the world a better place. It will not happen overnight or by itself, but only if there is a willingness for reform, negotiation, and compromise. But IPI didn't just pierce the Iron Curtain. 5 years later, South Africa hosted the 43rd IPI World Congress. It was just weeks before the historic 1994 elections that made Nelson Mandela the country's first black president and ended the apartheid regime. The Congress was opened by the two main protagonists in South Africa's transition to democracy, Mandela and F.W. de Klerk. In his keynote speech to a room filled with leading editors from 5 continents, Mandela affirmed that critical, independent, and investigative press is the lifeblood of any democracy.
The free flow of ideas and information is one of the objectives we will strive for in the Constituent Assembly that will emerge from the forthcoming democratic election.
The Congress returned to South Africa in 2014. Former President de Klerk once again took to the stage, this time to reflect on the achievements and challenges of the past 20 years.
It needed to be done to avert a catastrophe. But more importantly, it needed to be done because we sat and found ourselves in a situation which was morally indefensible, which was wrong, and we had to put the wrong right and bring justice to all South Africans.
In 2015, the Congress took place in Yangon. It was right after the end of almost 5 decades of military rule in Myanmar and just months before landmark elections. IPI's global network of members showed support for the country's democratic transition and honored those who had fought so hard for it.
We learned that the world is united in condemning brutality against journalists. Even when we may disagree over content, we can agree that murder is never acceptable. But we also learned how fragile the right to press freedom is, the right to freedom of expression is. We saw how quickly some call for restrictions when that appears to be the easiest solution, forgetful or possibly ignorant of the consequences of such restrictions. And finally, we learned once again that ideas need to be expressed and that it is the debate that emerges from the expression of such ideas that brings us forward in our understanding of what is right. As journalists, as representatives of civil society, as defenders of human rights, we have little choice but to strive for perfection. And I trust that the discussions in the next 2 days will bring us one step closer to understanding where perfection lies.
Okay, so thank you very much for the trust here.
In 2020, despite all the challenges of COVID-19, IPI held its first ever virtual World Congress. It featured 19 sessions and 60 speakers. It brought together more than 500 attendees from 64 countries to explore how to reimagine journalism following the disruption brought about by the pandemic.
But please help us, all of us collectively, IPI, congrats, because you're doing a great job helping protect us.
The heart of IPI is its global network of members. In the first decade alone, more than 1,200 leading editors and journalists became members. By 1965, IPI had expanded operations to 32 countries, especially in Africa and Asia. It was here that we created a series of training institutions. The idea was to give journalists in newly independent countries the know-how to build a media sector based on quality and independence. Today, IPI members are based in nearly 100 countries worldwide. They come from leading print, broadcast, and digital news outlets. The IPI network provides clear evidence of the universality of media freedom and the basic values of journalism. Our members are also the backbone of our work to defend media freedom. We stand up for our colleagues around the world whenever their right to work is threatened. As early as 1959, IPI members raised concerns about the grave difficulties facing editors and journalists in Turkey, with over 800 journalists sentenced or imprisoned since 1950. 60 years later, IPI members formed the same united front, standing behind IPI board member Kadri Gürsel, who was arbitrarily imprisoned for 11 months in 2016, along with a lot of other journalists targeted in Turkey's crackdown following a failed coup attempt.
As Vice Chair of the International Press Institute, I strongly urge the institutions of the European Union and all European governments to act in common against this recent violation of core values of free media by the authorities of Turkey. We as IPI demand the immediate and unconditional release of all jailed journalists.
This year, the entire IPI executive board called on the Philippines to stop the campaign of legal harassment against IPI board member Maria Ressa.
We support Maria Ressa, who is a champion for press freedom not just in the Philippines but also around the world. Journalism is not a crime.
I'm Marty Steffens from the United States, and I support Maria Ressa in her fight against the harassment of the Philippine government. What they are doing to her is unconscionable. It's quieting a very important voice, and they're using the power of the government to hurt the voice of the people. Maria, we are with you.
Wherever journalists face repression, IPI is there. We fight to ensure that journalists can do their jobs freely. We fight for justice for those targeted or killed for their work.
Today is the second anniversary of the murder of Daphne Caruana Galizia in Malta. She was killed in a car bombing on October 16, 2017. And we are deeply disappointed that Malta has made very, very little progress in finding who that person is. 2 years later, it's inexcusable, and it's inexcusable that this type of impunity exists within Malta and within the European Union.
In Slovakia, the murder of journalist Jan Kuciak in 2018 sparked the country's largest demonstrations since the Velvet Revolution. The IPI board gathered in Bratislava to jointly demand justice.
Žiadna beztrestnosť, no impunity. Justice for Jan.
There are people who feel they can kill journalists with impunity. We need to show that they can't. Let's remember Jan.
IPI has also been at the forefront of analyzing the challenges and opportunities that new technologies pose to journalism, from television to teletext to the internet and now to social media platforms. These have become critical for sharing news, especially in repressive environments, but they've also become tools to attack journalists and undermine journalism. IPI's pioneering On the Line program seeks to raise awareness about the consequences of online harassment. On the Line also identifies tools to help newsrooms counter harassment.
I think what's more valuable is recognising that online abuse is a social and cultural problem, and so you need a cultural solution also. And that's where newsrooms can really come into their own, I think, by establishing a culture in the newsroom that doesn't tolerate abuse. That I think is the first step.
Today, IPI is meeting the needs of journalism and press freedom in a time of change yet again. Financial pressures are strapping newsrooms, even as watchdog reporting is needed more than ever. IPI is helping to fill that gap through the Investigative Journalism for Europe Fund, which in 2020 has provided nearly 1.5 million euros to support cross-border, collaborative investigative projects in the public interest.
That looked at models as to how serious and genuine...
Throughout 2020, as the economic crisis linked to the pandemic hit the independent news industry, IPI organized numerous webinars and online conversations to help its members identify effective strategies to sustain the production and dissemination of independent news.
So no, I think the future of journalism is solid. I think that journalism has shown it can adapt to changing times.
The coronavirus crisis has not only challenged the very survival of independent media, it's also brought about a wave of government efforts to control the media at a time when the free flow of news and information is critical. IPI responded by launching the COVID-19 Press Freedom Tracker. This monitors attacks on the press during the pandemic. The tracker has registered nearly 500 cases of journalists being arrested, censored, verbally or physically assaulted, or denied access to information. And at least 17 states have passed so-called fake news laws that stifle the flow of information. The tool quickly became a worldwide reference, used by the UN Human Rights Commissioner to call on states to respect and protect the work of journalists covering the pandemic.
As of 2nd of June, the International Press Institute counted 233 media freedom violations around the world. Those include verbal and physical attacks, and 86 journalists arrested or charged for reports critical of state responses to the pandemic or for simply questioning the accuracy of official numbers of cases and deaths related to COVID-19.
At IPI, we know that the fight for press freedom and independence is never entirely won. It's a fight we have to wage every day. At a special ceremony at IPI's 2000 World Congress in Boston, IPI honored its first 50 World Press Freedom Heroes, journalists who have displayed tremendous courage and resilience in fighting for media freedom and the free flow of news, often at great personal risk.
First, despite the risks, there are remarkable journalists all over the world who are willing to face them, courageous men and women who rise up in every generation to continue the ongoing struggle to report the news. Second, freedom of the press must be exercised to be real. Rights must be applied to remain robust for self-imposed restraints. Self-censorship, the sacrifice of quality for financial reasons, can erode the free dissemination of news and information as effectively as overt oppression.
In 2010, IPI increased the list to 60 at a special ceremony in Vienna. It now stands at 70. The IPI Awards not only acknowledge the profound courage and resilience of their recipients, but also strengthen the core values that keep the IPI community together: quality, solidarity, independence.
This award is not for me. It mirrors the hopes of many Angolans that changes will not come simply from political decision-making, but from a growing awareness amongst and stand from civil society. I am most grateful to the International Press Institute for this gift of hope that many Angolans are celebrating as their own triumph over the entrenched power of the country's bandits. Thank you.
For the past 70 years, the IPI Global Network has met the moment at critical times shaping today's world. We've supported dialogue, peace, and journalistic integrity. We've defended journalists' right to do their job no matter the circumstances. And that's exactly what we will keep doing.
The IPI can be proud of what it has done as a moral shield and rescuer over many years, and over many years must continue to do so with the support of everybody in this room.
In 1950, the founders of IPI recognized, in a world still recovering from the trauma of World War, that world peace depends on understanding among peoples, that such understanding depends on good information, and that information depends on understanding among journalists.
IPI has done a lot for the Caribbean already. A couple of years ago, IPI led a team that really worked hard to change the legislation in the Caribbean with respect to criminal defamation, and they have had a large amount of success. And I think that the media entities in the Caribbean, they were very happy and very relieved with the support that they got from IPI.
My involvement with the IPI has been one of the great privileges of my life.